everyone, and welcome back to another Ask an Artist. This week we're going to be discussing how to paint or how to prep slick surfaces. And so we're going to be talking about how to prep glass properly, how to prep plastic, and then also metals. But before we begin, we did have a question this past week in regards to glass painting, so we thought we'd answer it during this segment. And we're going to have Tammy Carmody answer the question because she is our expert on glass painting. So the question is, I've been trying to paint on glass. I use folk art acrylics made for painting on glass, but the colors barely show up. If I try to repaint after it dries, I can't seem to get the strokes the same, and it looks messy. Any ideas? So Tammy, could you answer that for us, please?
The very first thing she needs to make sure that is she has cleaned the surface of the glass, because that's very important that the surface is clean. So anything that you're painting, you need to wipe it off with rubbing alcohol. That takes any oils or greases or lotions or anything like that. What I have found with base coating, when you put the first coat on, and I also paint in folk art enamels, so that's the next thing she needs to make sure that the paint says enamels and not acrylic, because her question was acrylic, so we need to make sure that she's painting in enamels. When you base coat in enamels, the first coat is very translucent. It's not opaque. It's not like acrylic paint. It goes on very sheer. It's very messy. Like any type of painting, it has an ugly stage. So you put the paint on, and the best way of putting the paint on is to use the softest brushes possible to paint with, because if you use your regular acrylic brushes, they're a little stiff and the paint will give you a lot of stroke work. So what I use is Jelly Beans brushes made by Dynasty, and they're very, very, very soft bristles. So one thing too is you need to make sure you have no water in your brush. You can get the brush wet. You must blot it onto a paper towel. It can have some sort of no moisture in it, just be damp. So when you paint, these brushes are very, very soft. If you can tell how I'm pulling them back, there's no stiffness to them whatsoever. So when you put your paint on, again, the brush could be damp, but make sure you blot all the water out. You're going to load the brush in the paint, work the paint into the brush, and then put your first coat on. Once you've put that coat on, you need to make sure it dries before you can put the second coat. Then when you put the second coat on, it covers much better and you'll be much happier with the surface. Sometimes in glass painting, you might have to put 3 coats on if you're trying to get an opaque surface or an opaque background. So I use these brushes. They're available at jillybean.com on her website. They're very inexpensive. You get about 7 brushes, and I think they're $24.95 if I'm telling you correctly. But you get a couple rounds. You get a 1 and a 3 round. You get a liner brush, a couple flats. This is the big flat. I tend to use the smaller flat to do most of my base coating. So this is a number 1/8. So I use that most of the time. And I also use a number 3 and a number 1 round. The only time I really use this big brush is if I'm painting inside of a glass or a cup and I just want to cover a big surface. But for most detailing, I use those brushes. So basically, the first coat is going to look very blotchy, but because the bristles are so soft, you don't get the strokes. And it's very important that you work the paint out on your palette before going to the piece of glass so that you aren't getting big ridges of paint to begin with on your first base coating. It's much better to have several coats, light coats, than one big fat coat.
one of the first questions we have is, how do you prep glass properly? And what steps do you go to in order to make sure that your paint is going to adhere to it? And we have some resident experts here. We're going to begin with Debbie Bankston. So Debbie, what do you do to prep your surfaces, for your glass surfaces?
First thing is wash them, clean them, make sure that you don't handle them with your, the oils from your fingers and once you have them clean. So usually what I'll do is I'll take either a paper towel, or my favorite thing to use for a rag is actually old t-shirt material, because it doesn't leave fuzz and lint, and it's soft to the, for handling the glass. Then the Jo Sonja products, y'all have to help me remember the names. The Ultra Cover Gesso, which is a super gesso that has the bonding medium already in it, or the Jo Sonja multi-surface sealer. One of the other or both of those is what I use depending on what I'm actually going to use the piece of glass for. So if it's going to be something where it's going to get handled some, what I do is I start with a base coat of the multi-surface sealer to kind of give the glass a tooth, so it's no longer so slick. Then I like for things to be more opaque, so I don't actually paint directly on that. That's when I'll go back and I'll use either the same multi-purpose sealer and my color of acrylic paint, for example, and base coat that glass piece again. Or if I'm wanting the gesso surface to work off of, then I give it a coat of the Ultra Cover in usually the white, because that's all I have is the white. And then once all that cures, and when I do glass pieces, I usually base coat at least half a dozen pieces at the time, because I work on random pieces. I don't do multiples of the same thing. And I let them cure for anywhere from 4 or 5 days to a week. I just get them base coated, set them to the side, and then I go on to other projects and then come back to the glass pieces. Then once they are cured, if the Ultra Cover Gesso needs any light sanding, I'll lightly sand it, and it depends on what I know I'm going to paint on the surface as to whether I use an actual really, really fine sandpaper or just crumpled brown paper bag, which is one of my favorite things to sand with, because it knocks down ridges, but yet doesn't take off more than what you need, removed. Once I get it to that stage and I have everything wiped clean, then I just start painting my design. Well, I trace my design if I'm needing a pattern on there. And most of the time I just sketch with a pencil, unless I'm just doing it out of my head, and then I just begin painting. The one thing I have found is if I'm doing, say for example, a scene onto something, I have to be more precise and exact when I add my shading or layers to it, so that I don't inadvertently get any pickup places in it. But if I'm just doing stroke work, I just load the brush, stroke it on, and I usually let that paint cure. And when I say dry and cure to me are kind of the same thing. At least 3 days before I even attempt to put any sort of varnish on it. And then most of the time I use the DuraClear, either in the satin or the gloss. I let that cure for a few days, and then it's ready to either use or give as a gift or whatever I'm going to do with it.
Okay, Debbie, and I have another question in addition to this. Then
Okay.
Once it cures and it's all been painted and you varnished and it's cured again, can you then wash it?
No. What I do and the pieces I do are for decorative purposes only. So it's not a paint or a surface medium that will allow you for functional use and then to be able to clean it. I mean, you could, like the little pieces I've done that I put the little tea lights in, if they get dusty, I just take a soft cloth and dust the outside of them, but I don't put any moisture on them. But that's just for personal preference. And when I give them as gifts or pieces that I've sold, the recipient knows that it is decorative purposes only. It is not a functional as far as use for drinks. You know, you can't run it through the dishwasher because all your stuff will probably come off and go down the drain. Now, I have done glass plates where I have painted on the back side of them, and then you could still use the surface, like say to serve cookies or something. We call it dry food service, and then you just wipe the crumbs off, you know, and then you can use it again. But I haven't even done one of those in years, because the last ones I had, I gave the plates away before I actually painted them. I got tired of looking at them.
And knowing you probably bake something and put it on there too, because you are an amazing cook in addition to being all the other things that you do too. Thank you, Debbie. And then just one really quick last question. Can you use the Jawsonia sealer on plastics also?
You can. Now, back a few years ago, it was real popular to buy those little they had bubbles in them, and they looked like an ice cream cone with the little swirl top. We were getting them at the Dollar Tree store. I've got a picture somewhere. I can post it in the group just to refresh everybody's memory. Those needed to be prepped with something. When I first learned about the Jawsonia products, I had actually bought something that had a slick surface on it, and it was probably like a MDF type surface, and I wanted to paint it, and I wasn't sure how to prep it to get the paint to stick. Well, I had messaged Peggy Harris. She told me about those Jawsonia products, so I immediately ordered them, got them in. Then at the same time, those little ice cream cone snowman ornament things were becoming popular. So that's what I base coated those with. I used the sealer and the gesso, you know, both from Jawsonia. I didn't have any that, you know, I mean, they all made the paint stick to the surface with no problem.
Okay.
And I probably did about 50 of those ornaments.
Okay, thank you, Debbie. I appreciate all your time. Tammy, I know that you do so many amazing glass designs, and a lot of yours are done a little bit different with Debbie, where they're more transparent, and I believe you might even be using glass paints. So you want to explain your approach to painting on glass?
Sure. The first thing you do is you have to clean the glass before you can paint on it. I use rubbing alcohol, and you only have to put it on a paper towel. So you put a little bit of rubbing alcohol onto a paper towel, you wipe the surface down to remove any oils or greases or lotions or anything that might be on the glass. Once you get ready to paint on the glass, you can do one of two things. You can paint directly onto the glass. I use two different paints. I use either Folk Art glass enamels or Deco Art glass enamels. I prefer Folk Art because I do a lot of stroke work, and I like things to be opaque. So I use, for me, the consistency of Folk Art is much thicker and creamier, where Deco Art is a little bit more transparent. So that's just preference, what you like to use. Once you do your painting, there's two rule of thumbs about painting on glass. Water is your worst enemy. So it's okay to get your brush wet, but you must blot all the water out of the paint so that the bristles are just damp. The other thing is you must use a very light touch, because if you push hard, it's a slick surface. So all it does is slide the paint across the surface. So it will not adhere. So if you can keep in mind no water and a very light touch, you can achieve just about anything onto glass. If you have to apply a pattern, I suggest that you can do one of two things. You can tape the pattern onto the glass and apply regular white graphite to the outer edge of the glass to do base coating. If you are just doing stroke work, you can just freehand it on, especially flowers. I paint a lot of flowers, and everything is freehand. I find that it's much easier to do stroke work freehand. But if you need to base coat, the other thing you can do is take the pattern and tape it to the inside of a glass. So say you're working on a wine glass and you need to paint a snowman. You take, excuse me, you take that pattern, tape it to the inside of the glass, and then you have something to follow. Most of my painting is on surfaces that you do use. So the rule of thumb is you paint the design that you're going to paint, and then depending on the type of paint that you're using, if you use folk art, you only have to let the piece sit for an hour, and then you can put it into the oven and bake it and follow the manufacturer's instructions. If you use deco art, they recommend that it sits 24 hours before you bake it. Once you bake it, it becomes dishwasher safe on the top shelf of the dishwasher only. My rule of thumb, though, if you are a painter, hand paint, hand wash.
Mhm.
If you sell to consumer, their first thing they ask you is, can we put this in the dishwasher? And I always say, it's best to hand wash, but if you absolutely can't do that, top shelf of the dishwasher only. Multi-surface can also be baked on, but of course you can't bake plastic. So I just paint with regular multi-surface if I'm painting, say, plastic hummingbird feeders, and then I set them out in the sun and let the sun just do a number to them, because most of these paints take 21 days to cure. So for instance, if you're glass painting, there's two options. You can paint the piece, let it sit for 21 days, and then that cures the paint and it becomes dishwasher safe. If you don't have 21 days, which I never have 21 days because that's going to the consumer and you never know what you're going to run out of, I paint it. I try to let it sit an hour to 24 hours depending on the time, and I put it in an oven. You place your glass in a cool oven, set the temperature for folk art 350 degrees, and bake it for 30 minutes. Then the oven will cool down, and you will then pull your glass out after your glass has cooled down. Do not want to pull it out hot, because it's like any glass tempered. When you go from extreme temperatures, it will crack. So when you're doing plastic, you can't bake plastic. So I try to plan a little bit farther in advance, maybe a week, and I paint it and I set it out in the sun, and the sun tends to cure it fast. I've never had anything come back that's washed off. But I use multi-surface. And the difference is gloss enamels are a gloss finish. Multi-surface is a satin finish. So the look is slightly different.
Do you do any painting on metal?
Occasionally.
And how would you prep? How do you prep it?
I prep it with metal sealer. Just go to the automotive store or metal primer from, your local hardware store, and just spray it and then paint it.
Do you use a mask when you spray? Because we've been talking a little bit about harmful fumes, and with some of the other recordings. And I know that when you're working with Krylon or some of these automotive things, there's a lot of fumes. Do you wear like an N95 mask, or do you just do it outside?
Mostly I just do mine outside.
Okay.
So I do have a mask, but I hate to wear masks, which is why I'm staying inside now more than going out. But so if I'm doing a lot of something, I'll wear a mask, but for the most part, I just do it outside.
We've talked a lot about painting with plastic in the group, and everybody always has questions. Well, any type of chalk paint really adheres well to plastics and glass and other slick surfaces. So does the multi-surface paints. But as far as prepping it goes, I really like to use paint adhesion medium. You can, when it's a super slick surface, like let's say I was painting on vinyl or on a hard plastic, I would use this to prep it by itself, and then I would mix this with 50-50 with the acrylic paints, or I'd come in and do a base coat using chalk paint, because chalk paint really adheres well to slick surfaces. And I would also use both of those for glass too, using the paint adhesion medium and then some chalky paint if I wanted it to make an opaque surface. When I'm painting on glass, one of the things I do, like everyone else has said, you've got to wash it really well. If I want a transparent application of color, then I choose the right paint for that. If I were to come in with acrylics, one product that I really like is this Frosted Glass by Krylon. It will give you exactly that. It will make your glass look frosted, but then the acrylic paints adhere to it really well. If you're using, like if you're going to paint a glass block, this is wonderful because then the lights inside the glass block will still be able to show through the frosted part, while your acrylics would be more opaque and you wouldn't be able to see through them. Many times I just use the glass paints, either folk art or deco art glass paints, directly onto the glass, and then I bake them according to the instructions that are on the bottle. And my only prep then would be to wash the glass off. So, there's many ways that you can approach glass, and it depends on the overall effect that you want to get. I really like both Debbie Bankston and Tammy's explanations on how to prep glass. And I think we've given you all enough explanation on that. So now, when painting on metal, I have to agree that the best thing to do, if it's not already pre-prepped, because there were some metal pieces that you could always buy, and I remember Barb Watson sold beautiful metal pieces that were prepped. And but if you're finding metal pieces out, like at flea markets and garage sales, I think the best thing to do is to coat them with, clean them really good, get as much dirt off as possible, and then come back in with, I just use either vinegar, or sometimes I also use rubbing alcohol to make sure that they're nice and clean and ready to go. And then you're going to spray them with the auto primer. But if you have a manufactured piece of metal and you don't want to go through all that, you can use paint adhesive medium. I've used this a few pieces. I did a witch hat for Halloween and a few other pieces where it was very slick, but it was manufactured, and so it was very clean. So I simply used that on it. And then when I went to base coat it, I did mix the paint adhesion medium 50-50 until I knew that there was really a good, until I knew that it had adhered really well. There are special paints for plastic. We've talked a little bit about that for plastic and metal. The multi-surface paints work really well. However, I still use one coat of the paint adhesion medium on them before I start, just to make sure they're not going to come off, because I've had some problems in the past with paint coming And the last thing we want to do is go through hours of painting something and having it peel off like a sticker. Thank you so much for joining us today for our Ask an Artist segment, and I hope you've enjoyed learning about how to prep slick surfaces. Please join us again next week as we'll be covering a new subject, and until then, may painting always bring you joy.